Kingdom 2019. Set in the capital city of Hanyang, where the royal palace is led by a king named King Joseon who is currently sick. A famous healer from Dongnae named Dr. Lee and his student named Dongnae came to treat the king, when Dr. Lee told Dongnae to present the prepared herbal medicine. Dongnae gave it to him with trembling hands and suddenly Dongnae was pulled behind the curtain and what happened? The next morning posters were seen posted with the contents, "The king has died, a new wind will blow." According to the subtitles, that's what it means. The military chief ordered to arrest all those who had put up the posters, who turned out to be students, who had smelled the evil of the Haewon Cho clan since entering the government. The Haewon Cho clan began to undermine the government since Mu-yeong, the son of Cho Hak-ju, married the king and became empress. The empress's family had accumulated wealth for themselves and made the people suffer. As a result, 89 students were finally arrested and interrogated. And that was where the students exposed all the rottenness of the queen's family who had controlled the government since the king was declared ill. These students were sure that the king had died. But this was covered up by the queen because she was currently pregnant with the crown prince of the kingdom. If the king died, the throne would be passed on to the crown prince from the king's concubine who had died named Prince Lee Chang for 3 days. Prince Chang had knelt in front of the palace begging to be allowed to visit his father, the king, who was sick. But the young Queen Mu-yeong forbade him on the grounds that the king was sick with measles which could be contagious, so no one was allowed to visit him. Prince Chang was very disappointed with the fact that everyone in the palace was now more obedient to the Haewon Cho clan's orders. Then he went home and talked to his personal guard Mu-yeong that he would infiltrate the palace to visit the king, but Mu-yeong offered to go in and take the king's medical journal during the changing of the guard. But finally they agreed to enter the palace together. Prince Chang would visit the king and Mu would take the king's medical journal. They entered the palace secretly and separated in the hallway. That's when Prince Chang saw the shadow of a creature with a terrible voice followed by an extraordinary stench. Almost caught, they finally managed to escape. After checking the king's medical journal, Chang was surprised to learn that the last 10 days the journal was empty. From here Lee and Mu assumed that maybe the king had indeed died. But the question was why people still believed the king was still alive and why there was no funeral. From the journal, the name of a physician who last treated the king was finally found. Namely Dr. Lee. From here, Prince Chang finally decided to look for Dr. Lee who came from the medical clinic in the Dongnae area. They set off on a 350 kilometers journey on horseback. Moving on to the Daejeon area, at that time a female healer named Seo-bi was treating her patients. The condition at that time was very critical, where the people were starving and lacking food supplies. A few moments later, Dr. Lee came from Hanyang carrying the body of Dongnae who was already dead due to being scratched by the king who had turned into a monster. Dr. Lee then ordered to bury Dongnae's body, but when Seung-hui asked what happened, Dr. Lee said nothing happened. Then left. Meanwhile in Hanyang, the chairman of the state council Cho Hak-ju, Mu-yeong's father who is currently the queen, is discussing how to get rid of Lee Chang who is currently the only heir to the throne even though he was born from the king's concubine. In addition, they also discussed the demonstration carried out by the students, who was the mastermind behind all this, because so far not a single student wanted to admit it. And here Cho Hak-ju was sure that everything was Lee Chang's doing, and at that time Cho Hak-ju ordered to detain Crown Prince Lee Chang because he was accused of inciting students and planning a rebellion. But when the soldiers were about to arrest Lee Chang, it turned out that Lee Chang was not at his residence. Lee Chan and Mu, who were on their way to find Dr. Lee's clinic, stopped at a residential area and were sad to see the lives of the people who were very miserable. At that time Mu asked about the whereabouts of Dr. Lee's clinic, and here it was found that Dr. Lee had returned to Dongnae because his student was seriously ill because he had many wounds all over his body. At that time Mu invited Lee Chang to go home because Dongnae was still far away and the prince looked tired on the road, but Lee Chang still insisted on continuing the journey to Dongnae. Lee Chang said, if he returned to the kingdom without bringing evidence of the king's true condition, then it would be the same as going home to commit suicide. Because if Mo-yeong the empress gave birth to the crown prince, then Lee Chang as the son of the concubine would definitely be killed by the Cho clan because he was considered a threat. In addition, Lee also said that the only way to save the students and this kingdom was only to prove Cho Hak-ju's guilt, namely with Dr. Lee's testimony to prove that the face had actually died. And finally they continued their journey to Dongnae. Meanwhile, Cho Hak-ju found out that Lee Chang was looking for Dr. Lee, and then he sent soldiers to capture Lee Chang before he arrived in Dongnae, and Seung-hui and her friends were looking for medicine in the dry forest, and at that time they had time to discuss the strange wounds on Dongnae's body which looked terrible. That afternoon Seung-hui came home and was surprised to see the patients who were previously hungry now eating heartily. Seung-hui went to the kitchen and saw Yeong-shin cooking there. When Seung-hui asked what was being cooked, XX only answered that he was hunting deer because people were starving while Dr. Lee locked himself in his room. Seung-hui was quite happy to hear that XX had managed to get deer, and when a patient came who asked for more, then Seung-hui went to the kitchen to get it. But when she poured it into a bowl, how surprised Seung-hui was to find human finger fragments. She then met XX very angry. Here it was discovered that XX had cut up Dongnae's body and cooked it. Seung-hui couldn't understand how XX could have the heart to cook human flesh and give it to people. But XX answered that this was the only way to survive during a food crisis, rather than people dying of starvation. And this was also done by people in the southern region, namely becoming cannibals. Outside suddenly all the people who had eaten earlier all vomited and had convulsions, then they became unconscious. And when Mu-yeong tried to help one of them, suddenly Seung-hui and XX were surprised by the noise in the treatment room, and when they checked it, yes, Mu-yeong had died eaten by the patients who had turned into predatory zombies. When night fell, Crown Prince Lee Chang and Mu-yeong rested after walking all day, eating dried meat supplies that had been heated, then slept beside the fireplace. The next morning they entered a forest that felt strange. The atmosphere was so quiet, even the sound of insects could not be heard. Mu tried to check and he saw a house at the end of the forest, then they headed there. Apparently the place had entered the Dongnae village, and the house they saw turned out to be the Jiyulheon clinic where Dr. Lee practiced, but strangely the clinic looked quiet and there was no life. And made them even more surprised was that there were many bamboo spears installed along the walls and the doors were sealed. Mu tried to break down the gate but failed. Then he climbed the wall and opened the gate from the inside. Chang and Mu entered and saw a very quiet atmosphere. There were no people, but a lot of blood was scattered, and also the tips of the bamboo spears covered in blood were still fresh, making them even more surprised. When they entered the clinic building, suddenly the floor broke and Lee fell, and that's when he saw under the floor many bodies in terrible conditions. Mu then looked for the judge's office to report the incident, and soon some soldiers from the Dongnae country came and pulled the bodies out. The army commander did not realize that Lee was the crown prince of the kingdom. And here Mu pretended that Chang was his younger brother. Then the army commander asked if there was anything suspicious when Mu arrived here. And Mu only answered that he only saw bodies. After all the bodies totaling 48 people were removed from the deck of the house, then taken to the judge's office for examination. And among the bodies, Chang did not find Dr. Lee's body. And he was sure Dr. Lee was still alive. In Dongnae, apparently a new judge had just been appointed, and it was his first day on duty. He was Cho Hak-ju from the Haewon Cho clan named Boom-il, where at that time the Dongnae officials were partying to welcome Boom-il as the new judge. Boom-il then ordered his troops to look for the perpetrators of the murder of these corpses. Who here they suspected a young man named Yeong-shin who had been collecting bamboo in the forest for 2 days. And the soldiers spread out looking for Yeong-shin. While one of the bodies was being autopsied, here the autopsy expert said that this was not an attack by a wild animal but more like a human bite, which of course did not make sense. While the Dongnae soldiers were busy looking for a young man named Yeong-shin, Lee Chang focused on finding Dr. Lee, accompanied by Mu. He entered the village and asked everyone, and one of the residents turned out to be a herbal trader who often delivered herbal plants to the clinic. But he also did not know the whereabouts of Dr. Lee, but after Mu offered a gold coin, he finally wanted to give other information that might be useful. Namely about a female doctor named Seo-bi who went to the frozen valley to look for the existence of a power plant. Mu and Chang immediately went there based on the father's instructions earlier. Back to Hanyang Palace, some people are seen carrying a corpse from the main building and taking it to the middle of the forest and then sinking it at the bottom of the river. And at the same time, 3 officials are discussing the condition of the kingdom that is being taken over by the Haewon Cho clan in a cunning way. When a maid comes to inform that in the main building there are often dead people and most of them are palace maids. From the maid's information they are sure that something bad is happening in the palace. And they must immediately find the feces so they can save the crown prince. The students and themselves from the cunning of the Haewon Cho clan. Lee Chang and Mu-yeong arrive at the frozen valley. As the name suggests, the valley is so cold that almost all places are filled with frozen water. Finally they find Seo-bi, who is digging the ground looking for a plant to revive, and at that time Seo-bi is told that Chang and Mu have just found bodies in the clinic, which makes Seo-bi shocked. Especially knowing that the bodies are now being taken to the judge's office. Seo-bi looks very worried and says that if the bodies are not dead, they will rise when the sun sets. Mu thought Seo-bi was crazy. How could a dead person rise? But after being explained by Seo-bi, the truth was like that, and it was also written in Dr. Lee's journal. They finally went to the judge's office to warn people. But in the middle of the journey, Chang turned towards the clinic to find Dr. Lee's journal. And at that time the troops sent by Cho Hak-ju to capture Lee Chang had also arrived at the clinic and found Lee Chang there and then intended to capture him. But Lee Chang refused, and finally there was a fight between Lee Chang and Commander Beom-il, the commander who was Cho Hak-ju's favorite son. At that time it was almost night when they were fighting. Suddenly a box made a sound and shook. 2 soldiers checked it in. A living corpse appeared from inside the box and immediately pulled them and bit them. Not long after, the soldier turned into a zombie and attacked Beom-il until he finally changed too. Lee Chang managed to avoid it and beheaded Beom-il. At the same time in the judge's office, Yeong-shin found out that the bodies in the clinic were in the judge's office. Yeong-shin reminded the judge that they would rise again. But no one believed, even Yeong-shin was considered crazy, and that's when Seo-bi and Mu came. Seo-bi then confirmed Yeong-shin's words. But still no one believed until finally Seo-bi and Yeong-shin were locked up. And when the sun began to set, people were still gathered there while waiting for the results of the examination, and suddenly one of the bodies rose, which turned out to be the body of a mother. From the crowd a man appeared who was her husband. He was happy that his wife was still alive, but This man was attacked by his wife's body and then followed by the rise of other bodies. The terror began, everyone scattered to save themselves. Anyone bitten by these bodies turned into a zombie monster. Yeong-shin and Seo-bi, who were locked up, heard the commotion outside. They already knew that the bodies would rise. Yeong-shin immediately broke the cage and escaped from that place, while Seo-bi was still in captivity. The corpses had arrived there. Many soldiers had been infected and turned into zombies. Judge Beom-il saved himself by entering Seo-bi's cage. At that time his guard was apparently bitten and suddenly changed, and when he was about to attack Seo-bi, he took a sword and stabbed his neck. In a short time, the zombies had spread throughout Dongnae, and only a few people survived. Meanwhile, Lee Chang, who managed to survive the incident at the clinic, had now arrived at a river and intended to cross. When a boat passed by, intending to call him, it turned out that the fisherman had been infected. And not long from a distance hundreds of zombies were seen running after him. Chang ran as fast as he could, and luckily Mu came to save him. They ran towards the border fort, and when they arrived there, hundreds of residents who were still alive were seen heading there to ask for protection. But the officials and border guards refused to open the gate. And suddenly from behind came hundreds of zombies that attacked, which made everyone run. Many of them did not survive. Luckily Mu and Lee Chang managed to escape by jumping into the river and swimming across. From there they realized that what Seo-bi said yesterday was true. And that night the resurrected king was seen preying on a palace maid, witnessed by Cho Hak-ju and her child, who was pregnant with the crown prince, the future successor to the king. Cho Hak-ju said, "The king must stay alive until the queen gives birth to a baby and inherits the throne." Back to Dongnae, most of the people there have become zombies. Seo-bi and Beom-il are trapped in a cage and can't go anywhere. It was almost morning, the sun began to appear. The zombies ran looking for a place to hide. Yeah. Apparently they couldn't stand the sunlight. All of them ran and went under the houses, under rocks, and some even went into the well. The atmosphere seemed to be calming down after last night's chaos. The survivors began to come out of hiding. In the judge's office, Seo-bi and Beom-il came out, and there was already a sly official who had come. Yeong-shin, who was also there, was then asked what happened. Yeong-shin only answered, "Didn't I tell you? But you didn't believe it." Yeong-shin was accused of keeping something a secret, but Seo-bi defended him. Yeong-shin added that the only way was to behead and burn the bodies. But the commotion occurred when a former official's mother came and did not accept that her child's body was burned because it was considered immoral. During the debate, Lee Chang came and slapped the sly official because last night he didn't want to open the fortress gate so that many victims fell. They didn't know that Lee Chang was the crown prince. And when Chang showed the royal seal, everyone finally bowed and knelt down to Chang. Chang then ordered to find and burn the bodies before night and told Judge Beom-il to prepare a boat so they could save the surviving citizens to a safe place. And gave a danger signal to the entire country so that other countries would be alert. Returning to Hanyang, the officials who were still loyal to the king were still doubtful about the rumor that the king had died. They then intend to go to the king directly to prove it, and will also contact a very influential nobleman named Hanyang, who is currently grieving and alone in his hometown in the Sanju area. Hanyang was a war hero who made a great contribution to the kingdom, so he earned a position of honor and was respected by everyone because of his intelligence. Hanyang was also a great teacher who taught science to students. The student leader secretly sent a letter to Hanyang to convey that in the kingdom there was currently a betrayal committed by the Haewon Cho clan which was masterminded by Cho Hak-ju. But the letter was discovered and seized by the royal army and handed over to Cho Hak-ju. Cho Hak-ju paid no attention to the letter, because he believed that soon power would fall to the Haewon Cho clan with the birth of the prince of the Haewon Cho clan. Meanwhile in Dongnae, Beom-il was relaxing waiting for Seo-bi, whom he had called to meet him. When Seo-bi arrived, Beom-il apparently had feelings for Seo-bi because she had saved him yesterday. But Seo-bi did not understand Beom-il's intentions at all and instead checked Beom-il's health condition. And here Seo-bi found that Beom-il was suffering from gonorrhea, aka King Lion, aka Monic flu. A moment later Mu came and picked up Seo-bi to be taken to meet Crown Prince Lee Chang. And not long after, a cunning official also came to deliver the bad news that all the ships had been damaged and only one cargo ship could be used. Basically, Beom-il was kind-hearted and still thought about his people. But this cunning official was too cunning so that this slightly stupid Beom-il just followed his assistant. Seo-bi, who was taken to meet Lee Chang, arrived at the clinic. Dr. Lee's journal had been found and there Seo-bi explained everything. It was written there that the king had actually died, but Cho Hak-ju covered it up until his daughter, who was the king's consort, gave birth to a prince who would automatically become the successor to the throne. And Cho Hak-ju asked Dr. Lee to revive the king with a resurrection plant. Finally the king came back to life but became savage and preyed on humans, until every night there must be a maid who became a victim for the king's food. And chaos occurred when the body of Dan-i, Dr. Lee's student who died because he was attacked by the king, was finally eaten by the patients at the clinic. As we have discussed in episode 1, when he was still alive, Dr. Lee also had time to explain that the incident in Hanyang was not like this, where the resurrected king did not infect his prey. But now the virus has mutated so that anyone who is bitten will be infected. But Dr. Lee is sure this can be cured. And when it turned out Dr. Lee himself became the victim. With the discovery of the king's medical journal, Lee Chang finally had evidence of Cho Hak-ju's crimes and betrayal. But he needed the help of the most influential and respected nobleman, and he was Hanyang, his teacher. Meanwhile, Beom-il was already at the dock, and because there was only one ship, not everyone could be transported. This cunning official continued to incite Beom-il. The important thing is that we are safe with them. But in his heart Beom-il doesn't have the heart and still thinks about his people. The residents who were left behind were now confused about where to save themselves, and that's when Lee Chang, Mu, Seo-bi and Yeong-shin came. On Seo-bi's advice they intended to hide in the clinic, because it felt the safest and Yeong-shin had made a shelter. They rushed there before nightfall on foot and struggled because they had to go through the forest and hills. On the way they found several bodies hiding under rocks, which meant the plague had reached there. Lee Chang told everyone to run immediately. When they were close to the clinic just as it was getting dark, the bodies rose and started chasing them. Some of the residents were already inside while Lee Chang and his friends were still behind and being chased by a group of zombies. By struggling as hard as they could, they ran and saved themselves until they were finally able to enter the clinic and close the gates tightly. That night they didn't sleep, because outside hundreds of living corpses kept trying to get in. On the same night the ship that Beom-il and the Dongnae officials had boarded continued to sail. Without realizing it, there was a chest containing infected corpses and began to go on a rampage until some of them finally became zombie monsters that made the ship uncontrollable and stranded. And on the side of the river there were also so many zombies roaming around. And the morning that had been awaited finally arrived. The corpses were gone and they began to feel a little relieved. Lee Chang ordered to prepare food and treat the injured. In fact, there was no food available. Finally, Lee Chang gave up his dried meat supplies to be distributed to the people. When Mu called Yeong-shin, Mu was surprised who Yeong-shin actually was, seeing his shooting ability which even exceeded soldiers in general. When they were talking, it turned out that outside there were royal troops sent by Cho Hak-ju to capture Lee Chang after learning that his beloved son was beheaded by Lee Chang because he was infected. The troops read the queen's order to capture Lee Chang, who was accused of being a traitor. This made the residents disbelieve. And a moment later the royal troops shot fire arrows that killed several people inside. They ran to hide. Finally, the royal troops broke down the gate and entered. Fortunately, at that time the hill fog and smoke covered the view. Yeong-shin alone tried to fight back and managed to defeat several soldiers. Then Seo-bi also helped. Meanwhile, the residents were taken out through the back door and told to go to Yeong-shin district for shelter. Mu and Lee Chang ran into the forest, then followed by Seo-bi and Yeong-shin. They continued to be chased by royal soldiers, but finally they managed to get far away, helped by the fog, and headed to the Sanju area to meet Minister Yang. From Hanyang, a danger sign fire was seen on the top of the hill, and this made the royal officials start to be alert. Meanwhile, the king's loyal followers intended to meet the king to make sure that the king was still alive. Initially, Cho Hak-ju and the empress did not allow it. But Cho Hak-ju seemed to have other plans, so he allowed the three of them to enter. After entering the palace and being in front of the king, who was lying down, these loyal officials knelt down. And when it was almost night, and suddenly, the king woke up from his sleep and looked very savage, wanting to eat human flesh. That's where Cho Hak-ju uses his cunning by saying that the king is suffering from an epidemic that makes him sleep during the day and thirst for blood at night. However, he is still a king, so that Crown Prince Lee Chang cannot replace his position as king. And with his cunning, finally the student leader Kim's son was arrested for being accused of being a criminal who incited students to rebel. Mu-yeong, the empress, is seen talking to her father Cho Hak-ju about the next plan, where Cho Hak-ju said, at this time she will not let Crown Prince Lee Chang live because he killed his son Beom-il. After escaping the pursuit of the royal soldiers, Lee Chang, Mu, Seo-bi and Yeong-shin rested that night on the riverbank. Lee Chan and Mu were talking about their next plans when Yeong-shin came after checking the surroundings and making sure there were no more soldiers chasing. Meanwhile, Seo-bi, who was looking for medicinal plants, was surprised by the figure of a person approaching. Thinking it was a zombie, Seo-bi screamed. Then Lee Chan, Mu and Yeong-shin ran towards him. Apparently the figure was Beom-il, and Lee Chang immediately kicked him because of his behavior that only thought about himself. Apparently only Beom-il survived the incident on the ship. Then they rushed to continue their journey to Songju, teacher An-young's hometown. In Songju, there was a carnival or folk festival, a kind of debus attraction. The issue of the plague in Dongnae had reached Songju. This was actually used as a source of profit by several traders who sold amulets that they said could ward off the plague. There, An-young was seen being approached by one of his disciples and said that a fire signal of danger had appeared from Dongnae, and reportedly many victims had died. But their bodies had come back to life, which made An-young stunned. Then An-young told his disciples to get ready because they would soon go down the mountain. It was seen that An-young was so respected in Songju, and suddenly someone reported that there was something strange in the river. Then they went there. An-young saw a ship stranded on the edge of the river, and when checked the ship was empty and there was no one there. There were lots of blood marks, but not a single body was found. Meanwhile, Lee Chang and his entourage arrived at a village in the Songju area. There the residents were seen cooking rice and roasting pork. This made Lee Chang wonder, when everyone was hungry, why could they eat rice and meat? And a woman was seen carrying clothes that when Boom-il saw it he knew very well that they were the clothes on the ship. From here Lee Chang threatened to punish the residents if they did not confess. Finally one of the villagers spoke, that they had just looted a stranded ship, and they buried the bodies there. Lee Chang told them to show where the bodies were buried. Then they showed the place, and when they arrived in the middle of the meadow, they stopped and intended to kill Lee Chang and his friends. Because they thought they would still die because they had looted the state ship. But here Lee Chang convinced them that the bodies were more important than anything else. Apparently they stopped right above the bodies. It was almost dark, and sure enough, suddenly one of the bodies rose and attacked and was followed by the other bodies. They finally had to fight against the living corpses with difficulty until it was dark. But suddenly Hanyang came with his students and without hesitation beheaded the bodies. Lee Chang was surprised and happy to see his teacher Hanyang, whose purpose in coming there was to meet Hanyang. Hanyang always gave Lee Chang motivation when he felt down since his mother left. That night everyone stayed at Hanyang's residence. Seo-bi was quite surprised to see Hanyang and his disciples who came during the incident. They seemed to already know what happened and without hesitation beheaded the bodies, as if they already knew very well about this plague. In Hanyang, Cho Hak-ju was seen testing how the plague was transmitted by feeding the flesh of an infected person to a healthy person. And immediately the person changed and preyed on his friend who was still healthy. From here Cho Hak-ju was determined to prevent this plague from entering the northern region and Hanyang. Yeong-shin woke up very early and then he left by jumping over the fence. It turned out that Yeong-shin was from Songju. His village was not far from Hanyang's residence. He saw his village that had been burned down. Then he saw his family's grave, and he was quite surprised to see the incense still burning, which indicated that someone had just come there. At the north gate of Songju, a soldier had just come and given something to Boom-il, who apparently Boom-il had told him to look for the item on the stranded ship. And not far from there the military commander confirmed the truth of the news that the Crown Prince was here. And when that came, a soldier reported that the Fifth Army had departed from Hanyang to Songju to capture Lee Chang. And hearing that, Boom-il immediately looked for Seo-bi to run away with him. Because he was from the Haewon Cho clan and could definitely protect Seo-bi. Seo-bi refused. He said, "His Highness Lee Chang has struggled to save the people you left behind. Now you are going to leave him, coward. If you want to run, run by yourself. I will stay with Prince Lee Chang." In the capital of Hanyang, pregnant women were seen being entertained by the kingdom. They ate very heartily, because this was the first time they had eaten something this delicious. There was also Mu-yeong's wife who was pregnant with their first child. In the palace room, Empress Mu-yeong was seen preparing to attend a royal meeting. At that time Mu-yeong entered and was greeted with respect by the royal officials. Cho Hak-ju then read out Her Majesty's decree which stated that the king was sick and the throne was empty. While Crown Prince Lee Chang had betrayed and would seize the throne, therefore Empress Mu-yeong would take over the throne and become queen. And the first order from the queen was to eradicate the plague that was terrorizing the country. For that, the kingdom sent the Fifth Army to take over and seal the defense forts throughout the region. The Fifth Army has arrived at the north gate of Songju. Then the leader of the Fifth Army intimidates the commander of Songju Fortress to come to Anyong. The fortress commander then comes to Anyong's residence and asks to hand over Crown Prince Lee Chang because the Fifth Army will only open the fortress seal if Lee Chang has been handed over. Anyong comes out calmly and says that he will hand over the crown prince, and they head to Lee Chang's inn. But apparently there are already palace troops who will arrest Lee Chang and call Lee Chang a traitor. Hearing this, Anyong is offended and says that the real traitor is Cho Hak-ju. Then Anyong immediately signals his troops to slaughter these palace soldiers, and the Songju fortress commander is very worried that Cho Hak-ju will be furious with this incident, but Lee Chang explains that so far Cho Hak-ju has never cared about Songju. And when that came, a messenger said that outside the fortress many Songju residents were asking for protection. And they went straight there. Lee Chang ordered to open his fortress, but the fortress commander did not want to open it, which with his authority as the crown prince, the commander was fired immediately. Then the fortress was opened and people entered to take shelter. After that, Lee Chang ordered to block the road by setting traps and bamboo spears. They all worked hard to make a defense before night came, and told everyone to hold weapons, because this was a battle against human-eating zombies. There everyone had started thinking about how to survive with such a large number of refugees and limited food supplies. Boem-il approached Seo-bi, who was cleaning the medicinal plants, and confidently gave the plants he brought to Seo-bi. And Seo-bi was very disappointed when she found out that what Boem-il brought was just ordinary wild grass. Then Seo-bi decided to search for herself in the forest. Boem-il accompanied her. While busy searching, suddenly Seo-bi saw a marked place, and Boem-il immediately stopped her because according to the people in the judge's office, the dangerous place was called the Frozen Valley. Hearing the name Frozen Valley, Seo-bi wanted to go there even more in the hope of finding the resurrection flower. Unable to be prevented, Boem-il finally followed her. Not long after, sure enough, Seo-bi found the flower she had been looking for all this time, the resurrection flower. However, in the corner of the rocks there were traces of a person's body being released. And not long after, a living corpse appeared on the edge of the lake. And as a result they were trapped there. And in the fort, Yeong-shin is seen training the soldiers how to shoot. Anyong is quite amazed to see his shooting skills, and it is known here that Yeong-shin is a former soldier sent by Sumong village to help Anyong's troops 3 years ago. Because it was almost night, they checked all the weapons and traps again. And when the sun began to set they were on alert in the fort and in the blockade area. With fear and horror they were on alert to face thousands of corpses carrying the plague. Fortunately that night no zombies came. Until morning came. They were quite relieved because they could get through the night safely, and some of them began to rest. But when they were about to return, suddenly thousands of living corpses were seen in the distance running towards there. And without hesitation Lee Chang gave the signal to prepare for battle. Meanwhile in Hanyang, pregnant women who were gathered in the palace were seen getting special treatment. That day one of them gave birth and it happened to be a girl. And Queen Mo-yeong was also seen getting ready to take a bath accompanied by the chief lady, when a lady took off her clothes. How surprised this lady was to see that Queen Mo-yeong was not really pregnant. Mo-yeong had deceived everyone including his own father by faking her pregnancy. 3 years ago when the Joseon King's army fought against the Japanese army in the Songju region. The Joseon King's army from Hanyang was led directly by the supreme commander at that time, Cho Hak-ju, and assisted by local troops led by An-yeong. It seems that they have just lost many soldiers. At that time, Dr. Lee Seung-hui was called by Cho Hak-ju with a resurrection plant. Dr. Lee explained that the essence of this plant can resurrect people who have died. But he will rise as a bloodthirsty monster, but his body, which is basically dead, will slowly rot. For those who haven't watched the previous story in Season 1, the link is in the description of this video. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment and share this video as encouragement for me to summarize films for you. Back to the present. After a night of no zombies coming to attack Songju Fort, so they decided to rest, but suddenly a roar was heard from the forest, and not long after, thousands of zombies appeared running towards them. This made them very surprised. Why were the corpses now coming out during the day, and they were on alert? Lee Chang ordered everyone to be ready to fight. The cannon that had been prepared turned out not to be able to fire, because the gunpowder had gone soft. The front line guards tried to hold it with arrows, then ran to the fort. Yeong-shin and his friends immediately got on the raft, some jumped into the river. The ditch they had prepared was quite helpful, but it was not enough. In just an instant, the ditch was full and the zombies reached the protective wall. An-yeong ordered the cannon troops, but it turned out that it could only last a short time. The thousands of zombies broke down the gate. Although Lee Chang encouraged his troops to hold on, An-yeong suggested retreating, and considering the number of people to protect, Lee Chang ordered the troops to retreat. And sure enough, when they ran, the protective fence collapsed. The river lane defense had apparently been breached first. The troops ran to the fort and tried to climb as fast as possible, while the zombies were getting closer. Some were finally bitten and fell. The increasing number made the atmosphere even more terrifying and tense. Lee Chang, An-yeong and his friends had just arrived at the north gate and saw that the zombies were already there, so they could not enter the fort. While behind them there were also hundreds of zombies chasing. An-yeong remembered that in the past during the war a canal was made that led into the fort and they headed there. And Yeong-shin, who apparently also headed to the canal, and they joined. However, the canal door was apparently locked, and they had to break the lock with great difficulty. The zombies chased them to the canal and they made a makeshift fort while waiting for the lock to come off. Mu intervened to remove the padlock while the others were holding back the zombies. And the padlock was finally released. They immediately entered the canal, but the door could not be closed, and there, loyal guard An-yeong sacrificed himself to hold the door. And it was a heartbreaking dream for An, Lee and everyone who saw it, but they were forced to leave. Yeong-shin could not bear to see his friend suffer, and finally, they managed to enter the fortress and were still wondering why the zombies were now coming out during the day. Seo-bi and Beom-il, who were trapped in the frozen valley, were now trying to climb the cliff to save themselves. Seo-bi finally realized that these zombies were not afraid of sunlight, but were afraid of high temperatures, like the character of the revival plant that likes cold temperatures. Seo-bi will go to Mu-yeong Seje to research the antidote to the plague with the revival plant that he had just found. Because currently the closest area that is still safe is only in Mu-yeong Seje. Boem-il just follow. In Hanyang, rumors began to be heard about an epidemic in Dongnae and Songju areas. Currently, the closest area that is still safe is only Mu-yeong Seje. Some Hanyang people believe that it is a curse from evil spirits, so they hold ceremonies and sacrifice cows and put protective signs on their houses. At that time, the Minister of Security wanted to meet Cho Hak-ju, but the chairman of the State Council was in Mu-yeong Seje because there was a serious problem. Finally, The Minister of Security was invited by the head of the royal division to see the bodies of pregnant women who had just given birth and their babies found at the North Gate. Queen Mo-yeong was performing a ritual by inviting a shaman with the aim of getting a baby boy from pregnant women, because she herself was actually only pretending to be pregnant. The Mu-yeong Seje area was an area that was still safe from the plague besides Hanyang. At that time Seo-bi and Beom-il had arrived at the Nungyeon fortress. Cho Hak-ju, who witnessed the arrival of his nephew Beom-il, was very angry. Why did Beom-il not do anything when Beom-il was beheaded by the crown prince? And Beom-il replied that he did not know anything. And Beom-il introduced Seung-hui to Cho Hak-ju, and hearing that Seung-hui was a student of Dr. Lee, Cho Hak-ju ordered that Dr. Seung-hui be brought along when they returned to Hanyang. At Songju Fortress the zombies were still outside. At that time Lee Chang asked why Cho Hak-ju knew that Lee Chang was going to Sanju. Did Mu-yeong leak the secret? Mu-yeong was shocked by the accusation, because he had fought with the crown prince so far. And when they were talking, suddenly a scream of fire was heard and they went straight there. The food warehouse was seen burning, which made them all feel desperate to survive. Even if they were not bitten by monsters, they would still starve to death. Lee Chang planned to go to Mu-yeong Seje. In addition to seeking help for the Sanju people who needed food, Lee Chang also intended to kill Cho Hak-ju and take over the leadership and eradicate the plague. However, to get out of Sanju they had to pass through a herd of zombies, and to enter Mu-yeong Seje they also had to face the Fifth Army. However, Lee Chang was determined and asked selected people to go with him. As a result, the zombies in the canal were lured to leave there with the blood of the Sanju soldiers from the fortress. Lee Chang and his troops left Sanju Fortress through the canal, and when they passed through the door, there was still the body of An-yeong's aide who sacrificed himself by holding the door to save his friends. After moving the body, they continued their journey to Mu-yeong Seje for several hours. In Mu-yeong Seje, inside one of the tents, Seung-hui is thinking about how to make an antidote while holding a resurrection plant. Then suddenly he saw a shadow of someone carrying a stretcher towards the main building where Cho Hak-ju was. Then Seung-hui followed him. And apparently Seung-hui witnessed that the resurrected king was already in Mu-yeong Seje, and his chains had been removed. After a long journey, Lee Chang, An-yeong and several chosen people arrived at Mu-yeong Seje. Then they climbed the fortress wall and entered the Cho Hak-ju army camp in Mu-yeong Seje. They began to slaughter one by one the soldiers in the tent, while Lee Chang himself focused on finding Cho Hak-ju with the aim of killing him. Apparently Cho Hak-ju had known about the arrival of Lee Chang, An-yeong and several of his colleagues, and apparently Cho Hak-ju had planned a trap for them. As a result, Lee Chang met Cho Hak-ju, and Cho Hak-ju told Lee Chang to prove for himself that his father, the King of Joseon, was still alive. Then Lee Chang was locked in a room with his father, who had broken free from the chains and immediately attacked Lee Chang. Lee Chang continued to try to avoid the attacks of his father, who had become a monster. Meanwhile outside, An-yeong tried to come in to help Lee Chang. But in front of the door of his palace Mu-yeong was standing Cho Hak-ju. Cho Hak-ju accused An-yeong of siding with the traitor, but An-yeong said that the real traitor was Cho Hak-ju. And An-yeong also told the truth that Cho Hak-ju had revived the deceased king with a reviving plant to maintain power, because soon the king's son, the heir to the throne, would be born. When An-yeong was about to open the door, Cho Hak-ju told the soldiers to shoot him, but the soldiers did not dare because An-yeong was a very meritorious and respected person. However, When Cho Hak-ju beheaded the soldier who refused, the other soldiers were forced to open fire. Hanyang finally fell. He tried to get up and open the door, and there stood His Majesty the King, but apparently Lee Chang had beheaded his father because there was no other choice. Cho Hak-ju was very happy to see that his trap had worked. And now Lee Chang had been declared the king's murderer. Hanyang finally died after whispering something to Lee Chang and saying that Lee Chang was the king of the country. Lee Chang and his gang were then arrested on charges of murdering the king. Meanwhile in Hanyang, the Royal Commander Division became increasingly suspicious of the discovery of several pregnant women's bodies and saw blood spilling from the direction of Nizanje, Queen Mo-yeong's private residence. The Minister of Security then asked if you were sure you would search the Queen's private residence, because this was related to the very influential Haewon Cho clan, but this commander insisted on revealing the truth. And a spy immediately reported to Queen Mo-yeong that the commander of the royal division had searched her private residence. That night, several stretchers were seen coming out of the Queen's pavilion towards the forest, and soon the Royal Commander Division came and immediately checked every room. At that time, fresh bloodstains were visible under the carpet. Then the soldiers spread out to investigate. Outside, excavated soil was found, and the commander suspected that this was a place to bury the bodies. They also began to suspect the stretchers that were brought into the forest and chased them. And here the truth was revealed that these pregnant women were killed after giving birth. And baby girls were strangled to death, but not baby boys. Although it is not yet known who the perpetrators were, the royal commander suspected that the perpetrators wanted a baby boy. And apparently Cho Hak-ju sent a letter to Hanyang, which contained that before he died the king ordered to overcome the plague and punish the traitor Lee Chang, who had beheaded the king himself. That day the whole country mourned the death of the king. The king's body, which was in Mu-yeong Seje, would be taken to Hanyang to be buried. And there was also the body of An-yeong, who was still neglected, and because An-yeong was a person of service, he too would be buried properly. While in the Hanyang palace, a meeting was being held to prepare the king's funeral and also touched on the matter of the vacant throne, and they had to decide immediately. The Minister of Royal Affairs said that if the queen gave birth, then the baby would automatically be the successor to the throne. And not long after, a messenger came who said that the queen was in the process of giving birth. Seen in the maternity home, the Queen Mo-yeong was waiting for news from the chief lady about the whereabouts of the baby boy. And on the other hand, the royal commander met with the Minister of Security. And the Minister of Security said if the commander wanted to investigate the truth, then do it immediately before the queen gave birth. Back to Mu-yeong Seje. In the name of Cho Beom-il, Seo-bi asked the guards permission to examine Prince Lee Chang's wounds. And after being in front of Lee Chang, Seo-bi wrote something on the floor. And in prison, Yeong-shin and his captured friends suspected each other of a traitor among them. But Yeong-shin said this was not the right time to suspect each other. Then they looked for a way to get out of the prison. The king's body was ready to be sent to Hanyang. All the troops had packed their tents. Besides that, Cho Hak-ju also ordered to bring the prisoners, namely Lee Chang and his gang. As soon as the prison door was opened, Yeong-shin and his friends fought back until they got out and faced the soldiers, seeing that Cho Hak-ju ordered to kill them all and leave only Lee Chang. At that time, Yeong-shin got the chance to shoot Cho Hak-ju, and apparently Cho Hak-ju's guards blocked him and Yeong-shin was finally arrested. Lee Chang had just arrived there, and not long after, A zombie figure appeared which was none other than An-yeong, who immediately attacked Cho Hak-ju because he smelled the blood on Cho Hak-ju's body. An-yeong was shot with arrows, but none hit his head until he reached Cho Hak-ju and bit him. Cho Hak-ju then fell but was still alive. Lee Chang swiftly and without hesitation beheaded An-yeong, which immediately stunned everyone, considering Lee Chang immoral to behead his master after beheading his own father. But after that, Lee Chang explained to everyone that this was what happened to his father, who was resurrected by Cho Hak-ju after he died, just like An-yeong's resurrection from his death. Then Lee Chang asked Seung-hui to explain scientifically. Lee Chang also explained that all of this was at An-yeong's own request shortly before he died. Oh yeah, guys. For those who haven't watched the previous story, please check the description for the links to the previous videos. After that, everyone in the palace finally believed in Crown Prince Lee Chang and now wanted to follow him. Lee Chang then ordered to send food supplies to Songju Fortress. The royal troops, guided by An-yeong's followers, headed to the fortress with difficulty because they had to face thousands of undead aka zombies who had no morals. In Songju Fortress, people were so happy with the food aid because they had been starving for 2 days since the fire at the food warehouse there. In Hanyang, the nobles there were still waiting for news from the maternity hospital about the birth of Queen Mo-yeong's child, because if the queen's child was born, then according to the state's rules, he would be the heir to the throne. Meanwhile, the Royal Commander Division was interrogating a lady-in-waiting to uncover the case of the deaths of pregnant women and baby girls in Neo-sanjae. The lady-in-waiting remained silent, and when that happened, a messenger came who said that there were 6 stretchers that came out of Neo-sanjae yesterday, but only 3 were found in the forest. And the other 3 were apparently taken to the palace, to be precise to the Queen's maternity hospital. And at that time the Royal Commander Division headed to the Queen's maternity hospital. And sure enough, there were 3 stretchers under the roof. The military commander then entered the maternity ward to check. But in the end he was arrested and was to be executed on the Queen's orders because Queen Mu-yeong was worried that her secret would be revealed. 6 out of 9 pregnant women had given birth and all of them were baby girls. Now it was Mu-yeong's wife's turn to give birth, and the head lady smiled happily knowing that her baby was a boy and immediately conveyed the news to Queen Mo-yeong. Meanwhile, Seo-bi tried to treat Cho Hak-ju. There was also Boom-pal, who was worried that his uncle would turn into a monster. But Seo-bi explained that the contagious plague was caused by people eating corpses and in the clinic, while Cho Hak-ju's condition was exactly the same as the one bitten by His Majesty. Not contagious. Boom-pal then took out the medicine that he had worked hard to find for the Queen because he thought the medicine would be useful for treating Cho Hak-ju. But Seo-bi was quite shocked to learn that the medicine was consumed by the Queen, because the medicine was a gynecological medicine that was useful for preventing pregnancy. Which of course was a bit odd because the Queen was currently pregnant. And that's when someone suddenly came who was none other than Mu-yeong, bringing Cho Hak-ju to Hanyang under the name of Crown Prince Lee Chang's order. On the way, Cho Hak-ju's condition became more critical on the way to Hanyang, and Seung-hui asked to stop and find a place to rest. Then Seung-hui checked Cho Hak-ju's condition again. Mu-yeong found out about the Sekong medicine consumed by the Queen. Then he asked Cho Hak-ju, who was sick, what he was actually planning by gathering pregnant women in Neo-sanjae. But Cho Hak-ju apparently didn't know about it either. And that's when suddenly a voice was heard outside, and when Mu-yeong checked it, suddenly an arrow shot and landed right in Mu-yeong's chest. Mu-yeong ignored the only one arrow and beat the attacking soldier. These soldiers thought that Mu-yeong would hide Cho Hak-ju because they knew Mu-yeong was Crown Prince Lee Chang's personal guard. Then they took Cho Hak-ju to Hanyang, and at that time several arrows landed in Mu-yeong's chest again. Seo-bi tried to help him, but Mu-yeong asked Seo-bi to go with Cho Hak-ju and told him to reveal the truth. Lee Chang was quite shocked to hear the news that Mu-yeong had taken Cho Hak-ju, and invited several members including Yeong-shin to chase Mu-yeong who had taken Cho Hak-ju. They looked for a shortcut until they finally found traces of the carriage. And soon they found traces of blood on the snow and followed it, and it turned out that Mu-yeong was dying after being hit by an arrow from the people who kidnapped Cho Hak-ju. That's when Mu-yeong admitted his mistake of being a spy for Cho Hak-ju. The reason was none other than for the safety of his wife who was in Neo-sanjae, who was going to be killed by Beom-il at that time. Lee Chang felt a great loss, even though Mu-yeong had betrayed him. Lee Chang still respected him as someone who had always been loyal to accompany him. In his last breath, Mu-yeong asked Lee Chang to save his wife who was about to give birth. Mu-yeong finally died in the arms of Crown Prince Lee Chang, and it was quite heartbreaking for Lee Chang, because basically Mu-yeong was a loyal personal guard. And he became Cho Hak-ju's spy because he was forced to for the safety of his wife. That night Cho Hak-ju, together with Seo-bi and Beom-il, arrived in Hanyang. Seo-bi again checked Cho Hak-ju's condition, which was increasingly critical. Seo-bi began to analyze the plague sufferers who were afraid of fire and water. Here he began to think that the parasite that caused this plague must have avoided water because it was a threat. Then Seo-bi tested it by soaking Cho Hak-ju's entire body. Although Beom-il was afraid that his uncle would die, Seo-bi was sure there was a secret that could be revealed. Finally Seo-bi soaked Cho Hak-ju's body, and it was seen that the parasites came out of Cho Hak-ju's wounds and died from exposure to water, and Cho Hak-ju's condition began to improve. And that night the nobles congratulated the queen on the birth of her baby who would continue the throne. Meanwhile Lee Chang and Yeong-shin went to Hanyang to pick up Mu-yeong's wife. And when they arrived at Neo-sanjae, they found people dumping the bodies of pregnant women, and among them was Mu-yeong's wife who was still alive. The military commander, troops and his entire family were finally caught and were about to be sentenced to death. At that time Seo-bi was with Beom-il. He saw Yeong-shin disguised and turned, and then he followed him. Yeong-shin said that Crown Prince Lee Chang wanted to meet Seo-bi tonight, and that night Lee Chang gave Seo-bi a message that the child brought by Her Majesty the Queen was Mu-yeong's child. He told Seo-bi to become Her Majesty the Queen's healer so that she could take the baby. Seo-bi then said that Cho Hak-ju survived after he removed the parasite from Cho Hak-ju's wound, which died if exposed to water, but he didn't know how to overcome the plague. Then Lee Chang, and by using Beom-il, Cho Hak-ju finally accepted Seo-bi to become the queen's personal healer. The next morning the nobles returned to discuss. Here the Minister of Security of the kingdom became increasingly suspicious of the case of pregnant women who died in Neo-sanjae from the report of the investigation results of the royal commander division. He suspected that Queen Mo-yeong had faked her pregnancy and took a baby boy who would be recognized as her child. This caused conflict among the nobles. And at that time Cho Hak-ju came and heard this. He was quite surprised. But he did not discuss it and focused more on eradicating Lee Chang and his gang who were slandered as traitors. Not long after Cho Hak-ju met Queen Mo-yeong with Seo-bi, who was carrying the prince. After drinking a cup of tea, Seo-bi was ordered to check Queen Mo-yeong's pulse. And here Seo-bi admitted that Queen Mo-yeong's pulse was not felt, which meant that the baby was not Queen Mo-yeong's baby. Cho Hak-ju was very angry because he had been deceived by Mo-yeong. Cho Hak-ju did not want the kingdom to be led by a commoner's baby. He planned to find a successor to the kingdom that had been exiled. He will also kill the baby and everyone who knows about it, including Seo-bi. While Mo-yeong itself will be exiled to a remote island. But when he came out, he suddenly vomited blood. Then died on the spot. It turned out that Queen Mo-yeong had poisoned his own father. Beom-il was very sad about the death of his uncle. Soon Beom-il was summoned by Queen Mo-yeong and appointed as the royal commander division to guard the palace. Beom-il then asked about Seo-bi. Mo-yeong answered that Seo-bi was assigned to Neo-sanjae. Because there was already a healer in the kingdom, even though in fact Seo-bi was locked up next to a plague sufferer, and told to learn how to deal with the plague. Meanwhile, Lee Chang apparently met someone who was still a royal relative who had been exiled by the Haewon Cho clan. And he was Lee Chang's uncle and asked him to return to the kingdom. There you can also see Yeong-shin following him. Yeong-shin hopes that Lee Chang's leadership can bring change and overcome the suffering situation of the people. That night Lee Chang gathered the soldiers who started to support him at a school after learning the true facts about Cho Hak-ju's crimes. Lee Chang explained to them that tomorrow their families in Hanyang would be dragged by the investigation bureau and would be sentenced to death because. Therefore, Lee Chang let them return to his troops and did not need to follow Lee Chang so that their families could be saved. Although in their hearts, they still defended and obeyed Lee Chang as the crown prince. The next morning the military command division that was arrested during the investigation of the deaths of pregnant women in Neo-sanjae and the families of soldiers who defected to Lee Chang were taken to the investigation bureau and would be sentenced to death. The Fifth Army leader saw this, and in his heart he was very disappointed with the Queen's decision after learning the true facts from physician Lee's journal. The chairman of the Royal Council asked the head of the investigation bureau to postpone the death sentence until the Neo-sanjae investigation was complete and the truth was revealed. But the head of the investigation bureau refused because this was the Queen's order, which meant the same as the King's order. And when the Fifth Army leader appeared and delivered the news that Lee Chang was planning an attack on Hanyang, and based on the report he asked for his family members to be released. Meanwhile Lee Chang and his members were preparing to enter Hanyang in disguise. And soon troops from Hanyang came to ambush the school where Lee Chang and his troops were last night. And when they rained arrows it turned out that it was empty and there was no one inside. Here the head of the Biso investigation realized that they had been trapped to get out of the palace. Meanwhile Lee Chang and several chosen people finally entered the Hanyang palace in disguise and took over the fort so that the soldiers who were outside could not enter. With the remaining troops in the palace, the commander of the troops prepared to block Lee Chang. Meanwhile at the execution site, the newly appointed Royal Commander Division, Cho Beom-il, read the execution order from the Queen. But in the end he was unable to continue, because deep down he could not bear to punish innocent people and he sat helplessly. And that's when Lee Chang and his members came, then freed all the prisoners, including the former Royal Division commander who eventually sided with Lee Chang. The Minister of Security entered the palace and suddenly drew his sword on the military commander and arrested all his soldiers. The nobles heard the news and looked panicked. While the head of the Dayang reported Lee Chang's arrival at the palace to the Queen, but Queen Mo-yeong was very confident that she would definitely be able to finish off Lee Chang. She didn't know that the palace guard troops had been defeated. The nobles who were detained heard the news that Crown Prince Lee Chang was in the palace and were very happy and hoped to help. The nobles, the military leaders mostly sided with Crown Prince Lee Chang after learning the truth that the Haewon Cho clan had committed a crime by reviving the deceased king. They finally arrived at the main building and entered the royal throne. And on the throne, Queen Mo-yeong was sitting holding the prince. And this is where the Royal Commander Division finally revealed the fact that Queen Mo-yeong had faked her pregnancy and the child she was carrying was not her own child but the child of the pregnant women who were killed in Neo-Sanjae. Crown Prince Lee Chang firmly removed Mo-yeong from the palace, but Queen Mo-yeong refused. At that time one of the nobles said that Lee Chang did not need to dirty his hands by killing Mo-yeong. He would take the royal stamp and make a letter of inheritance to Lee Chang. Meanwhile, the chief lady went to the detention room, where Seo-bi was also being held, and unexpectedly, it turned out that the chief lady would spread terror of the plague in the palace according to the queen's orders. And sure enough, immediately the chief lady was bitten and turned into a zombie. In a short time the people there had become monsters. But fortunately Seo-bi was still able to survive. And with great difficulty she ran to the main building to convey that the plague had spread in the palace grounds. Not long after that hundreds of zombies appeared attacking. Lee Chang immediately ordered to defend the palace, and beheaded the zombies, no matter if he was a noble. Mo-yeong looked happy with the incident, because for him, if he could not control the throne, then no one should have it. Instantly the screams disappeared, hoping that everything was over, but suddenly, outside the gate more zombies appeared and attacked. The Minister of Security was seen trying to hold the gate and told Lee Chang and the others to leave immediately, then he died. Lee Chang and his friends ran to the yard across from the palace and took cover behind the wall. The corpses were crowded in front of the gate. While Seo-bi looked increasingly frightened by the appearance of living corpses outside, while the day was getting dark, and Queen Mo-yeong looked satisfied with the chaos that was happening. It didn't take long, the corpses managed to enter the palace room, the guards tried to shoot them, and Seo-bi tried to make a fire to ward them off. The guards couldn't hold on, Queen Mo-yeong stood up from the throne and soon the monsters bit her. Seo-bi was left alone fighting to avoid the monsters with fire. And when he saw the baby carried by Queen Mo-yeong was still alive, then by burning a robe he got out of the palace room and hid in a room. Because these zombies were afraid of water, Lee Chang had the idea to lead them to the water garden behind the palace. They then lured these zombies with blood, some of them ended up being victims. Apparently the zombies managed to climb to the roof, which made Lee Chang quite overwhelmed. Then he knocked down the roof tiles and the zombies fell too. These zombies continued to follow the smell of fresh blood until they all headed to the back of the palace. Through the back garden they were chased and finally arrived at the water park. But unexpectedly, the pool water was now frozen and it turned out, it was not easy to break, until finally the zombies arrived there. While others tried to break the ice, others fought against the zombies. Some of them finally had to become victims, but the frozen water had not yet broken. Lee Chang looked tired and desperate. He tried to break the ice but it seemed in vain. A feeling of sadness enveloped him when he saw that most of his friends had died and turned into zombies. In the midst of his despair he continued to hit the ice layer with his fists. At that time a pile of living corpses chased him and Lee Chang lifted the corpse and threw it until the ice layer broke. All the monsters and people there drowned, including Lee Chang. the kingdom commander, Yeong-shin and Beom-il, who had been bitten. But here finally Seung-hui's theory was proven. That the parasite would die if exposed to water, and sure enough, parasites like worms were seen coming out of the bite wounds on Beom-il and Yeong-shin's hands. And finally only the four of them survived. Lee Chang returned to the palace when morning had arrived, and the atmosphere was quiet there. All that remained were the prisoners held by Cho Hak-ju. They then took all the bodies out of the pool. The royal commander found Queen Mo-yeong's hairpin. And at that time Beom-il remembered Seung-hui in the palace room. The student council chairman and Lee Chang were talking about the situation that had occurred. Then the commander came, who said that he did not find the prince's body, the baby that Mo-yeong brought. The student council said that the prince must be found and killed, otherwise Cho Hak-ju's followers who were outside Hanyang would definitely rebel. Yeong-shin and several people were checking the rooms in the palace, and that was when he saw Seung-hui's medicine purse. Lee Chang himself walked to the throne room and remembered that this room was his ancestral room, and somehow, Lee Chang knew that Seung-hui was hiding behind the king's chair and told him to come out. Seung-hui came out and showed the prince to Lee Chang, and immediately Lee Chang took out his sword, knowing that the baby's hand was bitten by a monster. But Seung-hui tried to convince him that this child would not turn into a monster. Previously, Seung-hui was ordered by Lee Chang to look after the child by becoming the queen's healer, because it turned out that Lee Chang already knew that it was Mu-yeong's child, his personal guard. The royal commander assured that this child was not the king's flesh and blood, but Lee Chang said that he was the prince's son, and there could only be one heir to the throne. Lee Chang finally ordered that this child become a good king, and noted that his father, mother and Lee Chang had died from the plague. And Lee Chang left. 3 months later, the plague ended. When spring arrived, the zombies died on their own because basically their bodies were dead and would rot over time. 7 years later, the prince grew into a smart and healthy boy and has now become king. The little king began to miss his parents, and what he knew, both his parents and his older brother had died because of the plague. And at a glance we are shown that Mu-yeong's wife, who is none other than the biological mother of the little king, is still alive and a lady-in-waiting in the palace. And at one point Beom-il met Yeong-shin and invited him to drink tequila. There Yeong-shin handed over Seung-hui's notes on handling the plague and told him that Lee Chang was traveling with Seung-hui to end the plague because the generating plants were still growing in various regions. Lee Chang, Seung-hui and the 5th Troop Commander found the generating plant. That night Lee Chang entered a village that had just been abandoned. Seung-hui checks a house and finds a newly used power plant. Not long after, the sound of bells is heard, people running, and there are newly resurrected undead coming to attack. And not long after, many bells are heard, and it turns out that many undead have been locked up, and there is a woman standing there. Meanwhile in the palace, the little king is seen sleeping, and from his scars, parasites are seen moving on his hands and face. It is still a mystery who this woman is and what will happen next to the little king, who apparently has parasites still living in his body. We are waiting for season 3, which is reportedly going to be released soon. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and enthusiastic. And see you in the next film storyline. Support this channel by subscribing. Thank you. See you in the next film discussion.